Good morning. Today we're going to be discussing the Cold War, the events that took place after World War II. But before getting into discussing what the Cold War is, let's take a look back and see how this whole thing got started. So we know from prior weeks that the Soviet Union during World War II counterattacked against Germany at Stalingrad, and they went from being on the defense to now being on the offensive, and that's why this is the turning point of the war in Europe. Now, they began to push towards the west, towards Berlin, after the counteroffensive of Stalingrad, and eventually the Western Allies, Great Britain, the United States, and France, landed in Italy, and then they landed in France, and they pushed their way eastward towards Berlin, and both of the allies, both sides, the Eastern Allies and the Western Allies, obviously seized Berlin and took it and ended the war in Europe. So here's the difference: is that when the Soviet Union advanced towards Berlin, they began to occupy a lot of Eastern Europe here. And what I mean occupy is when they defeated the Nazis, they took the countries for them, or the territories for themselves. The Western Allies, on the other hand, as they began to sweep through Europe, they liberated the Western countries of Europe and set them free from Nazi occupation. So this is really kind of where the foundation for the Cold War takes place. You have the Soviet Union occupying and taking land for themselves, and you have the allies of the West liberating. This is going to create a little bit of tension between Allied leaders towards the end of the war. So we're going to see that this was a fragile alliance. We had the big leaders, or as we'll call them, the big three: Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States, and Winston Churchill of Great Britain. So the first conference to kind of settle these issues was one known as Yalta. All right, this took place on the Black Sea in Russia. More towards the end of the war, we have February, then March, April, May. May is when Europe was finally considered liberated. At Yalta, there were a couple promises that we'll talk about in just a second, and we'll see that Stalin is going to break these promises, adding to tensions mounting to the Cold War. Then we had Potsdam. Potsdam was the actual conference where Stalin broke these promises, which we'll talk about. And this was the start of the Cold War. So this alliance between the Allies was very fragile. You had mostly Roosevelt and Churchill not trusting Stalin for good reason. So let's take a look at Yalta. All right. So the Yalta Conference, like I said, took place on the Black Sea in Russia. It's between the big three: FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. All three make a couple promises that are going to take place after the war, and that would be a better peacekeeping organization, the United Nations. You guys just did a web quest on the United Nations, so we'll be bringing that into the lesson as well. So Stalin makes a couple promises. He promises that those countries, let's go back and just take a look, that Stalin promises that he is going to liberate countries that he occupied: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria, all these countries in the East. And what happens is he's not going to fulfill those promises. He's going to hold those countries. He's going to want them, as he says, for a buffer between the West and the East. So he says it's for his safety that he is not going to give over those countries. So anyway, Stalin makes promises that he's going to break. Another major promise is that Stalin said that he is going to divide Germany between the other Allied countries, Great Britain, France, and the United States. The purpose of this was not to take over the country, but to rebuild it and help them build a democracy so we don't see another Hitler rise to power. Stalin, however, is going to continue his policy of occupation, and that is what he's going to do here in East Germany. So, Yalta, the promises are made. Well, what happens? In July of 1945, there's going to kind of be a final conference between the Allied leaders. and they're going to discuss what's going to take place after the war. Now, by this conference, the Germans had already surrendered. The Axis powers of Europe had surrendered, and there was only the Japanese to beat, and they were pretty much on the ropes by July of 1945. So going back to April, FDR dies. He's going to be replaced by Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States. Churchill, his Conservative Party was voted out, and Churchill is going to be replaced by Clement Attlee. The only original member of the Big Three is going to be Joseph Stalin. And I guess maybe Stalin felt a little bullish over the new guys, but he is not going to keep his post-war promises. So, we're going to actually not spend a lot of time on this slide, but goals for the United States after World War II was to promote democracy through Europe. And this is going to lead to stopping the spread of communism, which we'll either call containment in Europe or the domino theory in Asia, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So, Stalin ignores the agreements that were made at Yalta, and that was clear at Potsdam. And he begins to set up his satellite states, all of the nations of Eastern Europe that he had occupied. And he's going to say again that this is for my protection. These are buffers, all right? I've been attacked twice. I've been attacked during World War I by the Germans. I've been attacked by World War II during the Germans. It is not going to happen again. So I want some kind of dead space here. And I'm going to keep these countries as Soviet satellites, extensions. So Churchill visits Fulton, Missouri, the hometown of Harry Truman, in early 1946. And he delivers a famous speech saying that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended, across the continent of Europe. There's supposed to be the word iron curtain in here, but as you can see, there is not. So iron curtain, basically that Europe has become divided between the free West and the Soviet-occupied East, these satellite nations. And this iron curtain, which isn't a curtain, which isn't a wall, but a metaphor for the division of Europe. And it has run straight across the continent from the Baltic to Trieste. And it runs through Germany, through Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, all the way down to the Baltic Sea. So this is Churchill's warning. So what is the Cold War? The Cold War is going to be an ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this struggle basically is the Soviets want to spread communism throughout the world, and the United States wants to maintain democracy, contain communism. And this is one of the things that are going to lead, or the major reason that the Cold War starts. And the Cold War is going to be considered a proxy war, an indirect war, a war of ideology. And this is going to, instead of having battlefields, you're going to see spying, espionage. You're going to see both sides, once both sides have nuclear capability, begin to stockpile their nuclear weapons and try to gain other countries' support. That's my U.S. and Soviet unicorns battling it out. So one thing it's important to understand is the policy of containment. Former ambassador of the Soviet Union to the Soviet Union from the United States came up with this idea that containment was necessary, that in order to stop the spread of communism, we're not going to go into existing places where communism exists and fight, but we're going to do our best to contain it. So think of even this virus that's going on today. People are contained. They're not really supposed to go out in public and socialize because there's an idea that those germs, once contained, will be able to beat the virus that way. So containment to keep something from spreading, all right? And the idea was, if you look at this map here, is to keep it from spreading beyond the borders that we established during Churchill's speech, during the Iron Curtain speech. We'll talk about Asia and during another lesson, but this is pretty much containment is the policy of Europe, in Europe, to fight communism. A couple things I'd like to mention that some tools that the United States used. One was the Truman Doctrine. So the United States is going to allow these countries that want to get rid of communism, we're going to provide them money and arms to fight communism. So we're not going to do it ourselves. That's why this war is indirect, but we're going to offer arms and aid to these countries that want to fight. Great Britain was doing this at the end of World War II, but they just couldn't afford to. So the United States becomes the leading supporter of anti-communist movements, and one was through the Truman Doctrine, where we gave $400 million. This was successful in Greece and Turkey, who both fought successful rebellions against communism. Another plan was the Marshall Plan. All right, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall came up with a plan to provide economic aid to countries. The idea was, if we give enough money to Europe, that these countries would rebuild and become successful, and they wouldn't be susceptible to communism. It's kind of like, think of a vaccine. We give enough money to Europe. Europe's war torn. It's beat down from World War I and World War II. We're going to rebuild it, and people are going to see the United States is awesome, right? The communists can't do this, but the United States can. So obviously, capitalism, democracy must be the great system to trust. So we lent Europe $100 billion in economic assistance after the war. The Soviets tried. They had something called the Comecon, but it wasn't successful. Also, this sets the stage for the future developments of the Cold War. That in 1948, it's decided that Germany is going to officially be divided. And this is going to be between France, Great Britain, and the United States. And the Soviets get a very large section of the East. Now, the city of Berlin itself, you have to understand, itself was, even though it was an occupied Soviet territory, itself was divided. I should have provided maybe a picture of that. But the city of Berlin, the capital of Germany, is going to be divided, just like the map that you see here. So that's going to cause some tension. Stalin didn't want to be divided. He didn't want to give Germany eventually back, its ability to become a democracy. So he puts up a blockade as soon as the Allies split these countries. And what the United States does, along with other Allied countries, is we begin an airlift of supplies to and beyond the blockade. Remember, we have allies here in Berlin, so we have to get supplies to them. Stalin tries to blockade those supplies. So what happens is this is almost in 10 months we conduct 227,000 flights, and Stalin doesn't want to start a war because he doesn't have nuclear capability yet. So he lifts the blockade, and Germany remains divided. All right, so we're going to see in 1949 the four zones become the Federal Republic of Germany. So think of these as the Free West, the good guys, and Soviet occupied German Democratic Republic. Not saying they were the bad guys by any means, but they were controlled by the Soviet Union. Now, again, Berlin is going to be divided between East and West. There's a couple pictures of the Candy Bomber, one of the pilots that brought supplies to West Berlin after Stalin blockaded it. A couple things to mention. We see post-war alliances develop. The United States is going to join with the United Kingdom, Netherlands, Belgium, France, West Germany, Italy, Portugal, Turkey, Norway. Other nations join NATO. It's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is going to be an alliance against the threat of Western Europe, then pretty much all of Europe once the Soviet Union collapses. But NATO, it's still around today. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is an alliance to protect the Free West. Soviets make their own alliance. It's called the Warsaw Pact. Basically, this was the forced alliance between the Soviet Union and its satellites: Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, East Germany. So Again, NATO is the alliance of the West, and the Soviet Union creates the Warsaw Pact and forces its satellites into an alliance. Now, last thing we'll mention is the United Nations. In April of 1945, there was the San Francisco Conference, where 50 nations agreed to join the United Nations. They signed a declaration for it, and is created after World War II. Today, the United Nations has 193 members. Its main purpose is to maintain global peace. It has 6 major organs, which we'll see on the next slide. And its official languages are Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. And when these guys meet at the Security Council or General Assembly, they have translators, people that come in and make sure that everybody understands each other. There's a picture of the General Assembly. General Assembly is very large. It consists of those 193 members plus non-government organizations and just a very broad spectrum of people that come together globally and meet to discuss ideas. The Security Council. So we have we have 6 major organs. The 2 that we're going to focus on are the General Assembly and really the Security Council. So this ties into the Cold War. How so? Well, the Security Council, remember, the United Nations is going to be created by the Allied nations that were victorious after World War II. So the Security Council is kind of the major organ of the United Nations. It's the one that can deploy troops if there's a war, if there's an injustice done. They have a lot of power. The 5 permanent members were the major Allied countries that were victorious after World War II, and that would include China, Great Britain, France, and the United States, and of course Russia. So Russia was the Soviet Union after World War II. So the United Nations is going to cause a lot of debate between these free Western countries and Russia. And this is going to lead into further problems. So, like I said, I just want to understand this organ, especially the Security Council, is going to add to the Cold War conflict because you're going to have democratic countries that sit permanently on the Security Council, this major organization of the United States, and it's going to really become a debate forum between the United States and Russia. So I don't want to keep you any longer. This concludes our lesson today. Take your notes, please. Submit them to me, and have a great day. I will talk to you tomorrow.